All right, everybody. It's Steve with Real Progressives. Tonight, we're going to talk about PayGo. We're going to talk about some stuff that's going on with Pelosi. And we're going to talk about what some of the things that I'm seeing coming out of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's camp, which are a little bit frightening. I'm just going to be honest with you. But I'm going to read to you from Pavlina Tcherneva, who wrote a great article in These Times magazine. First, I want to start with an article from Matt Stoller. Hopefully, this article will help clear up some of the questions about the rules that were going on with the actual PayGo concerns. Obviously, to me, this is all smoke and mirrors, and I really believe that from the bottom of my soul. But there are some tricks here, so we're going to go through it because I think that's what you do when you're trying to do good due diligence. So here's the article. And I think it's really kind of an interesting article. Again, this is a Medium, and I do have the links put into the article here. It's called Congressional Staffing for Dummies, the PayGo Dispute. There are a lot of people arguing about this thing called PayGo. Here's my attempted explanation of what PayGo is, how it intersects with stuff you care about. So in order to understand the conflict, which seems on the surface quite simple, you have to understand a bunch of things about congressional process and budgeting. So let's start with PayGo itself. What is it? PayGo stands for pay-as-you-go budgeting, a concept that in theory means that bills Congress passes need to be deficit neutral. That is, for each proposed program or law, if it costs money, should also bring in an equal amount of money through either taxes or budget cuts. This is what's known among centrists in Washington, D.C., and frankly among most Americans as fiscal responsibility. A balanced budget by the government requires that you bring in as much as you spend. Well, now that I've gotten through the basics, here's what the fight is about. In 2010, Obama administration and the Democratic Congress passed a law to ensure Congress would be fiscally responsible. Nancy Pelosi was the speaker in 2010 when Congress passed the statute. And she is proud of being fiscally responsible. This law says that if Congress doesn't go through the PayGo process for its aggregate spending and taxing in the full fiscal year, the White House's Office of Management and Budget gets to choose a bunch of programs to cut in the process known as sequestration. Sequestration is in law. It was a law that was made sense at the time because Obama was president and Democrats didn't so much mind if a democratically controlled OMB got to make a bunch of important decisions. But guess what? Trump is now president, which means he is the one that gets to decide the cuts that happen if Congress doesn't use a PayGo decision-making process. Again, there's some speculation as to whether this is true or not. But here's the relevant statute. And the annual report issued at the end of a session of Congress under subsection A shows a debit on either PayGo scorecard for the budget year. OMB shall prepare and the president shall issue and include in that report a sequestration order that, upon issuance, shall reduce budgetary resources of direct spending programs by enough to offset that debit, as prescribed in Section 6. To conform to this law, the House had a rule to emphasize the importance of fiscal responsibility. Rules are different from laws. A law is usually a statute that applies to society and must be passed by both houses and signed by the president. A House rule is the mechanism by which the House itself operates, kind of the rules by which you run a meeting, like Robert's Rules of Order. Each body of Congress has its own internal set of rules. For instance, you may have heard of the filibuster in the Senate. That opportunity to block legislation with a small number of votes is a result of a Senate rule, and those rules are rarely changed. House rules are very different. They are set by majority vote and can be changed at any time. The Republicans had a House rule similar to PayGo, but it's called CutGo. This rule said essentially that you can never ever raise taxes and that all new spending has to be offset by other spending cuts. In 2018, Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats said they wanted to emphasize that they, unlike Republicans, were fiscally responsible. So she pledged to go back to the PayGo rule, both to conform to the 2010 statute and because she's proud of being fiscally responsible. She made another change to emphasize that Democrats, unlike Republicans, were friends of the people. The Republicans had a rule that said a tax hike required not just a majority vote of House members, but a 60% vote. Pelosi said she would change this rule and make it apply only to tax hikes that hit the bottom 80% of tax-paying public. The middle class isn't going to have their taxes raised under the Democrats, or so the thinking went. So that's where things stood until progressives got involved. We have a law we can't change without a House and Senate and President agreeing. But we also have a rule that the House majority can itself change at any point. Now, this is where it gets a bit weird, you see. The House has a rules package at the beginning of its session, but it also changes its rules pretty much every legislative day through what is called the Rules Committee. Every time the House puts forward a bill on the floor, it has to vote first on a rule for that bill. Floor time is extremely valuable because you need floor time to pass a bill. Rules structure how floor time is used, and every rule must go through the Rules Committee. Typical House rule will say that there's a bill that's being voted on. Here's who gets to talk on the floor. Here are the amendments that get to vote, and here's how much time to dedicate, etc. But a House rule can also change or waive any other rule at any other point, including rules put forward at the beginning of the House term, like PayGo. The Republicans, for instance, waived their cut-go rule to pass the Trump tax cuts. And rules are routinely waived or changed when the legislation for emergencies like war bailouts, disaster relief, or anything else Congress dubs an emergency. Notice they didn't say for the people. So in reality, anything put forward like PayGo is basically symbolic, and all that really matters is who runs the Rules Committee and what he or she had for lunch that day. The Rules Committee used to be nicknamed the Speaker's Committee because the Speaker stacks the committee with his or her cronies so that he or she can control what's voted on. The head of the rules is Jim McGovern, a close ally of Pelosi and a guy with a generally good reputation. It depends on where you stand. I don't consider these centrist Democrats or these corporate Democrats good, but whatever. McGovern hates PayGo and is the progressive caucus, but the argument is that if you can get rid of PayGo outright without getting rid of the 2010 law, then this automatically kicks sequestration budgetary cutting authority to Trump. If you keep PayGo but waive it on every bill, then that authority doesn't go to Trump. See the update at the bottom for more on this. Still, a House rules package that has PayGo provisions has some meaning, even if it isn't formally very important. Congress has strong institutional norms, so that if you do something one way, it establishes a precedent, and people generally like to follow precedent so they know what to expect. If PayGo weren't challenged, House Dem leaders could always just say about laws that they aren't deficit neutral. Well, that increases the deficit, and you know how we think about the deficit, and that would be the end of that. Even if PayGo could be waived in their rules at any moment. On the other hand, if McGovern starts waiving PayGo and rules, then it becomes the precedent, and everyone will expect going forward that PayGo will just always be waived. It may still be in the House rules formally, but it's a dead letter in reality. What I don't know are the contours of what McGovern promised, except that progressive priorities would not be subject to PayGo rules. Does that mean every bill? Just big ones? Non-controversial unanimous bills that fix small things, but that no one cares about? It's not clear. But then again, the reality here is that it is very unusual for a process reason to stop a bill. Process rationalizations like PayGo are basically only used as political cover. The ideological problem with fiscal responsibility. This brings me to part 2 of this blog post, which is the ideological problem with how we frame fiscal responsibility. In theory, Congress judges whether a bill will cost more than it brings in. But how do we know actually what that bill actually brings in money or costs in the future? We don't, because we can't predict the future. So, how does Congress handle this uncertainty? Well, in 1974, Congress hired a bunch of economists at what's called the Congressional Budget Office to make these projections to evaluate each piece of legislation. CBO is nonpartisan, so in theory, and if the economists had good models, this would seem to solve the problem, right? Well, not exactly. First of all, CBO is quite wrong quite often. That's just life. Predicting the future is impossible. Some estimates are better than no estimates, right? Well, once again, not exactly. CBO is wrong in dangerous ways. CBO is full of neoclassical economists who are basically people trained in doing econometric models using quasi-libertarian assumptions. When they score a bill, that means that they are making a long-term guess about the revenue and spending impacts of a piece of legislation. But these determinations and errors are highly political. Goldman Sachs' chief economist is an advisor to CBO. So is that of hedge fund D.E. Shaw. So are executives on a bunch of healthcare corporations. These people have a formal role as a choke point on our legislative process, as sort of a voice of God telling elected officials or elected leaders what the costs and benefits of proposed legislation is, even though those costs and benefits are arbitrarily selected based on political assumptions. Here's a real tangible error that caused long-term harm. CBO had been making an ideological assumption about monetary policy, and since the financial crisis, the interest rate paid on federal debt would return to 5%. But the interest rate stayed at 1 to 2% for almost a decade. This doesn't sound like a big deal, except for this assumption made progressive spending seem far more costly than it ought to be. This has changed as CBO noticed they were catastrophically wrong for years, but that doesn't repair the damage. Another example is the CBO determining that banking deregulation bills are costless because they don't have a model for calculating the cost of potential massive bailouts down the right. This is dangerous and allows people to move legislation that is effectively spending via gambling with a government backstop without having to account for its very real cost. So when you hear something is fully paid for, just know it means that an economist with a bad model made a guess and is probably wrong. But even more fundamentally, why do we care about whether a budget is balanced? We didn't really have this weird fetish over deficits and accumulating national debt until the 70s. Until 1974, the House spent money through one committee, Appropriations, and brought in money through a different committee, Ways and Means. If the government spent more than it taxed, it had to borrow money by issuing debt. If it spent less than it taxed, it retired debt. The debt is managed by a combination of the government's Treasury Department and the government's bank, which is called the Federal Reserve. The federal debt is older than the Constitution. So if there are long-term problems, they haven't shown up in 200 plus years. So why do people play the game of saying we must reduce the deficit? Well, that's an ideological question more than anything else. You might hear that America could go bankrupt, but that is ridiculous. We owe dollars mostly to ourselves, and we print dollars. America can no more run out of dollars than a bowling alley can run out of strikes. It gets even more ridiculous when you start to think about what public debt actually is. Look in your wallet, take out a $20 bill. To you, that's a bunch of money. It's an asset that you can spend on stuff to use or pay your taxes. But if you look closely, the bill itself is inscribed with an expression meaning that it is an obligation from the federal government to the holder of the bill. Yes, that $20 bill to you is a $20 piece of federal debt. Think about this, folks. All money is debt, right? And it has value to you precisely because it is an obligation of the federal government. There's trillions of this stuff in bonds and bills. In fact, the only real difference between a $10 bill and a $10 bond is that the bond pays an interest rate. Printing money and or issuing debt is actually super useful for people who need to pay for things in dollars, which is all of us. So saying we have to reduce the debt is dumb for all sorts of reasons. Maybe we do, maybe we don't, but it's just a question of whether or not there's enough money in circulation. And since we're growing all the time, we ought to be printing money all the time. In other words, money is made up of political commodity. It's a huge deal. And it's something that fancy people in suits spend a lot of time trying to lie to people about. Because if the truth were to come out that balancing the budget is just cover for letting neoclassical economists have a chokehold on how our democratic institutions operate, then the people themselves might want to spend some of it on things like healthcare or nice things for themselves instead of wars and bailouts that are somehow always emergencies and exempt from these PayGo rules. So why does Nancy Pelosi want to retain PayGo rules? I don't really know. I think that a lot of it is her reading that 2010 statute and a leeriness of Trump grabbing power and doing sequestration. But I also suspect it's ideological. In 1974, as part of the neoliberal revolution, Congress created CBO and the modern budgeting process that gets to a rule of thumb I have, which is everything bad started in the 70s. The idea was anti-democratic to its core, based on an assumption that elected leaders must defer to the adults in the room. If this case, the very serious economists who understand numbers, unlike those fuzzy-headed politicians, Nancy Pelosi, like generations of Democrats before her, including Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Steny Hoyer, and even some on the left, have a strange allegiance to this school of thinking. Democrats from the 70s to the early 2000s think the budget deficit is a report card in which the adults give them good or bad grades. It's weird and dumb, but no one will straight up just say we can print dollars, but actually we can and do all the time. This isn't just crazy. There's good reason behind it. In the 90s, balanced budgets seemed to work really well. The federal government had surpluses and the economy was awesome. Well, not in rural America, but ignore that since Democrats always do. Finally, the promise of the 70s that if we balance the budget, we get a great economy was here. Pelosi and generation of Democrats were extremely proud of this moment, and they want to revisit it. Now, it wasn't actually the surplus that caused the underlying economic boom of the 90s. That boom was caused by a bubble similar to that of the 1920s, which, not coincidentally, also saw budget surpluses right before the big crash, but we'll leave that aside. The bottom line is the very serious people we say we must reduce the deficit is to limit the ability of the democratic institutions to make choices over the political economy. This is the real function of the CBO and the real point of PayGo. People like Pelosi, who means well, I ain't buying it, by the way, saw this recipe deliver real wage gains in the 90s, and so she buys into it. It's not a crazy theory. It's wrong and anti-democratic, but not crazy and not born of ill intent. I say bullshit on both. There's an additional reason why people, not just political leaders, like balanced budget thinking. It frees us from responsibility for making decisions. Just like the independence of the Federal Reserve, we can choose to get rid of our obligations as citizens in a democracy if we just say that the hard stuff should be determined by men in suits who don't have to answer to voters. If, however, we choose to ignore the men in suits, then normal people, have to make decisions about trillions of dollars, and wielding power is scary. That's democracy, but it's scary. Since the 1970s, Democrats have believed that it is inappropriate for normal, non-fancy people to wield real power. Normal people can be ornamental elected officials and argue about social questions, but real decision-making about power should be done by businessmen, generals, economists, and so forth. Progressives have largely gone along with this, Progressive members generally went onto committees in Congress that don't deal with hard subjects like money, banks, guns, or spying. They want to go to committees that address healthcare, education, kittens, and hugs. This is a subtle deference to power and its ingrained cultural habit. But that's the old way of thinking. When Pelosi announced her intention to implement PayGo, there was a revolt. This flashpoint has become more than about symbolic House rule. Pramila Jayapal and Mark Pocan, who are heads of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which is the left wing of the Democrats, asked to remove PayGo provision from the House rules package. But they also asked for certain committee assignments for progressives on important legislative committees, the ones having to do with guns, money, and war. And they asked to remove the provision that required a 60% threshold to raise taxes. Pelosi isn't a deep thinker, and neither are most of these leaders, so they don't question the deficit mania orthodoxy they grew up with in the 70s. But Pelosi is also a deal cutter, so she's willing to basically let PayGo become a dead letter, if not remove it from the House rules entirely. She conceded to Jayapal and Pocan. She offered them slots on important committees and got rid of the 60% threshold rule on tax hikes. Jim McGovern promised to waive PayGo in the Rules Committee. Then bills go to the floor. So any symbolic power PayGo has is gone, and it likely will be removed next Congress. Some people think McGovern might be lying. He's not. Despite politicians having reputations as dishonest, most usually don't straight up lie. They dissemble, and they rarely lie to each other. If McGovern wanted to stop Medicare for all, he can come up with many excuses to do that, including, I'm the head of the Rules Committee. The answer is no. That's good enough. So he isn't lying. He isn't a liar, but he also doesn't need to lie. So the rule is probably meaningless, but that doesn't mean the fight is over. Because the 2010 law is still on the books and it cannot be removed by just the House rules package, Jayapal and Pocan have pledged to work on a law to get rid of that, and I'm told they introduced one today. Anyway, and they did. Anyway, that's where things are. Progressives pretty much got what they wanted. They were a number of political leaders saying hell no to vote against the PayGo rules, and a number of pundits encouraging this fight. I can't say it's wrong, since attacking budget balancing orthodoxy is useful. But I will note that it's a bit of a misplaced focus. Take yes for an answer and move on to the next fight. The next fight is both repealing the 2010 law and restructuring CBO so that it is no longer a weird power center floating in Congress with veto power, but no accountability to elected leaders. But that's for another day. Now, here's the final bit. Sorry, this was long, but I think it was worth it. Update. The argument from Pelosi's staff is that the 2010 statute requires PayGo rules in the House or else sequester authority passes to Trump's OMB. I've made calls, reread the statute, and I don't think this is true. First of all, nothing in the statute says anything about House rules, though there is something in there about needing a determination from the heads of different budget committees. Second of all, the sequesters are fairly automatic, so Trump doesn't have much discretion on what to cut, though I'm not sanguine enough on Trump adhering to laws as some of the people who have explained this to me. Third, the only thing that you really need to do, deficit spending, is a waiver on the PayGo law, which are always a part of negotiations for new taxing and spending laws. In other words, it could be waived anyway. The charitable reading for Pelosi is that having PayGo in the rules is a reminder on every bill that eventually spending that isn't budget neutral or emergency spending or otherwise doesn't have a waiver will cause a sequester at the end of the year. The Republicans, for example, just forgot about the PayGo statute when they passed their 2017 tax cut and had to scramble to negotiate a waiver. The uncharitable and frankly, more likely reading is Pelosi just wants PayGo in the House rules for ideological reasons. Steny Hoyer and Pelosi are emotionally quite attached to fiscal responsibility. In other words, they're neoliberals. Either way, this doesn't really change my analysis, and he goes on, finishes out. So what I want to do is talk to you all just a skosh about this. This is a little bit of a long reading, and I admit it, but I think it's important. I've been screaming no PayGo from Jump Street. I've been talking about it forever. And there's always, little teeny, subsections of rules and all sorts of other interpretations. But once you get past all the nonsense, what you need to know is this, and it said it in that very, very long but well-written article. All this is bullshit. The government creates dollars at will. There's just simply bullshit. And so anything that would in any way, shape, or form hinder being able to spend on the people is purely ideological. The OMB, which is there, is a neoclassical, neoliberal, freaking libertarian think tank, basically, that really pushes nonsense and really tries to use the worst possible readings of these budgetary numbers because they're really trying to stifle government spending to begin with, because their goal is to fatten the bank's wallets to make us go into private debt. All right. So with that in mind, Mark Stoller is somebody who knows MMT. He's a friend of Stephanie Kelton's. And you oftentimes will see Stephanie put his stuff out there. And she retweeted that, which is why I felt compelled to put it out there. But there's some alarming things that have happened today, and I want to talk about those. And one of them is Alexandria OcasioCortez came out and said, hey, it's possible that we're going to need to raise the wealthiest tax to 70%. And the way it was framed in Newsweek and other CNN, et cetera, was that what she was saying was to fund a Green New Deal, they're going to have to pay some 70% tax. Now, I know as progressives, we'd love to see the rich. It's not their fair share. We'd love to soak the rich because we don't want them to have that much of an outsized place in the economy. We don't want them to be able to buy up that many real resources. Okay. So there's a real legitimate reason why we want to tax them higher. But we know empirically, like, this is not a question of whether it's right or wrong. None of those taxes pay for shit. We're deleting buying power from the wealthy. That's what we're doing by taxing them at that rate. We're not actually paying for any programs. So when someone like Alexandria OcasioCortez steps in a landmine because some neoclassical nonsense is in her ear, or some well-meaning DSA person that doesn't understand the impacts of trying to fight a two-front war with raising taxes to pay for things when it's unnecessary, she gets caught on camera saying this. Now, I don't know that she's actually saying we've got to pay for this with this, but that's how they're trying to frame it. Right, wrong, or indifferent, it was an unfortunate framing. It may have been caught by the media and tried to spin that way because that's the way the media sees it, because the media has a neoclassical bend to begin with. They don't understand economics any better than Pelosi does. But it is still possible that even with MMT people inside of Alexandria Ocasia's head, that she's literally sitting there hearing voices from other people that maybe aren't as wise, maybe are placating the far left that wants to eat the rich and all the other nonsense that goes with this. Okay, not understanding that taxing them is only one way of actually attacking their free ride. The other ways are spending money on the people, because you take away so many things that the rich depend on, which are bad choices by the bottom, going into debt on the bottom. All these things fatten the wealthy far more than the taxes do, because there's always a way to dodge that stuff. Trust me, there is. And they always find a way to pass that money on, those costs on to you and I. So we got to be very, very careful, because I saw a lot of people, and it was very depressing. I'm not going to lie. A lot of people that I know and love that know damn well taxes don't fund spending, that are like, yeah, let's do it, man. Let's do it. And I'm like, okay, so let's play a game of order of operations. If you're going to tell me that we've got to fund this program with tax hikes, Not only do you have to get people that don't believe in climate change to go along with your Green New Deal, you've got to convince a public through all the propaganda that the right is going to throw at this, that in other words, this is important to do. We're going to have to fight through the socialist label. We're going to have to fight through all the ridiculous Agenda 21 nonsense. We're going to have to fight through all this stuff. But then on top of it, if that isn't enough, now we got to find a way to pay for it with raising taxes, when the Republicans already have signed the Norquist pledge. So the Republicans are walking out there with a loaded gun, man. They've got an Uzi 9mm. They're ready to take this fight to the hilt. They got a howitzer. They don't require us to do anything else because we've already shot ourselves in the foot. We're already fighting a difficult battle because we've got to go through years and years and years of, well, okay, so it's not climate change, it's now global warming, and it's not global warming, now it's this. And so they've got all these easy bumper sticker level, dumb, not true, but easy to consume statements that the public, much of the public, will eat up. Even so-called progressives who suckled up to Trump because they just didn't know any better, those people will still sit there and suckle up to this. So if you think that somehow or another it's a good idea to raise taxes to 70%, it may well be, but associating with paying for this is the most ridiculous, preposterous, economically illiterate, shot in the junk, self-inflicted, just a blown widget right in the gun sack, man. Stupid, 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 self-inflicted wound, if that's what's being done. I'm not saying it is, but I'm cautioning that if you all decide that it's such a good idea, man, let's soak the rich, do that separately in a tax bill. Don't do that while you're trying to pay for a Green New Deal. You've got so many hurdles already. And don't think for a minute that the GOP has forgotten with the Pete Peterson Foundation, who is well funded, unlike real progressives who desperately need your money. But Pete Peterson Foundation's got millions and millions and millions of dollars just dying to put this thing to bed. And every other Koch brother right-wing think tank desperate with Exxon money, you name it, ready to put the kibosh on this. And you guys want to fight a tax war that's unnecessary on top of it. Well played. Well played. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring up the next article, and this is Pavlina, Tcherneva. And this is really important because it's going to kind of explain what I just said in a lot better terms, more precise. And the links, of course, are in the narrative. So I'm going to bring this up right now. Again, this is In These Times. There's a picture of Nancy. And so this is by Pavlina, Tcherneva. And it says, PayGo is based on a fallacy. The U.S. government can dramatically increase spending without raising taxes. There is nothing more crippling to a bold policy agenda than the myth that the government can run out of money. This myth is behind every "but how will you pay for it" objection to proposals such as a Green New Deal and Medicare for all. A new House Majority Leader, Nancy Pelosi, Democrat of California, has even proposed instituting self-defeating PayGo, pay-as-you-go rules, which would require all new government spending to be matched with the increased revenue, wrongly prioritizing the balancing of the budget over the well-being of the public. Dispelling this myth is at the heart of an economic approach that is rapidly gaining a global following, known as modern monetary theory, MMT. MMT stresses that in the modern world, where government-backed currencies are no longer backed by gold or commodities, federal governments can't run out of financial resources. Unlike states and municipalities, which have hard constraints on spending, For the federal government, all funding shortages are artificially created. Did you hear that? Let me repeat that to you one more time. For the federal government, all funding shortages are artificially created. Understanding this changes everything, from the economic possibilities before us to what the public can demand from our government. Folks, this is that that paragraph right there is in essence what Real Progressive stands for. Anyway, everyone knows that only governments can issue currencies, dollars, yens, pesos. If households tried to do it, we'd be called counterfeiters. It should be obvious then that the sole issuer of a currency cannot possibly run out of it. But as Sherlock Holmes once observed, there is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. The public understanding of government spending is a classic case of cognitive dissonance. We regularly witness how the government immediately finds money when the policy priority is an endless war, financial bailouts, billionaire tax cuts. And yet, the public is generally convinced that, like a household, the government can go broke. If not today, maybe tomorrow, if it does not raise enough tax revenue to pay its bills. Debt limits set by Congress create the appearance that taxes and bonds finance the government. But if we follow the money, as MMT economists have done, and by the way, that little link right there is really worth going to. We're not going to do it right now, but you should do it. We find that the federal government does not spend tax revenue. Just listen to the Federal Reserve officials, and all these links are worth reading. And it cannot possibly default. Did you hear that? I'm going to read it in fast motion because it's worth hearing again. Debt limits set by Congress create the appearance that taxes and bonds finance the government. But if we follow the money, as MMT economists have done, we find that the federal government does not spend tax revenue. In other words, taxes don't fund spending. Just listen to the Federal Reserve officials here, and here, and it cannot possibly default. So where does the money come from? In practice, government funding is voted into existence every time Congress appropriates a budget for a given program. After the Federal Reserve, the monopoly issuer of dollar reserves, and the Treasury, the monopoly issuer of coins and bonds, coordinate to clear all payments. No government checks bounce. Ever. What this also means is that when the government runs a deficit and spends more than it takes in through taxes, it is adding dollars to the economy. And while politicians vilify the deficits when politically convenient, the public fails to spot that all the money spent by the government, except for that which is later taxed, lives in some person or firm's bank account or wallet. If we balance the budget, we would also remove those funds. Even those who understand this often resist bold government action for fear of inflation. And while MMT agrees that inflation is a relevant worry, we can avoid the inflation trap by focusing on how the government spends rather than how much. So long as money is put into the economy, is mobilizing unemployed resources and satisfying unmet basic needs, government spending can be done without causing inflation, and is, in fact, desperately needed. By highlighting the flexible and vast spending powers of the state, MMT opens new possibilities for solving our most pressing economic problems. The U.S. government debt and deficits are not among them. A clean environment, good jobs, and affordable education are in short supply. Green pieces of paper or digits in a bank are not. The bottom line, how will you pay for it, is the wrong question to obsess over. The right question is the more difficult and important one about the impact of government spending on the economy. Did it generate income inequality? Did it cause inflation? Or did it help build an economy that works for all? MMT economists favor policies of shared prosperity, like a federal job guarantee, a Green New Deal, tuition-free college, and Medicare for all. What are the real effects of these and other policies on the economy? Let's have a debate. All right, folks. That, my friends, was a lot of reading, but I think it was very, very worth reading. I think that you all should start being able to march in complete confidence. It's deeply troubling that I see people wavering on this stuff. I don't know whether it's because people like to be buddy-buddy with people and they decide that they just want to be able to hang out with the others and be able to, say what everybody else is saying because they don't want to be the odd man out that knows what's going on. I don't know. But I do know this. The information's there. To not know this stuff is an act of laziness at this point. I'm not giving you a pass because you're busy. We're all busy. It's a matter of what you apply your time of reading to. If you choose to read nonsense about Trump's comb over versus reading the stuff about the basics of the economy so you can learn that they're lying to you, then you've made a choice. You care more about Donald Trump's comb over than you do saving the planet from environmental disaster. It's okay to admit it. Let's just call a spade a spade. You care about reality TV. Some of us care about saving the environment. It's that simple, and it's okay. But let's not fib about it. Let's be honest. Okay? We got a lot of people that are thimble deep, that don't take a lot of time to read this stuff, that don't want to read this stuff, don't want to hear about it, and don't want to learn about it. When I sit there and talk about this stuff, I had somebody in my inbox complain relentlessly that I was having trouble with one of the Congress critters going out there saying, impeach that mother, or the other day, instead of understanding PayGo, and said, I've been following you for 2 years and I still don't know what MMT is all about. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's a damn shame, isn't it? That's just pure laziness. MMT can get really deep once you get way out in the deep end. But in the shallow end, it's shallow enough for you to watch your cartoons and eat your cereal, Peter Pan and Count Chocula and all the other stuff, Boo Berry and, all that good stuff. Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs and, whatever. Have your Raisin Bran and get your little toy out, whatever. I mean, you can still do that. All you need to know is the government creates its own money and it can't go broke. What's so hard to understand about that? For real. You don't need to know anything more than that to understand that they're lying to you when they say the government's broke. You want to get deeper? We can do deeper, but that requires some effort. I can't do that for you, but I can certainly read these things to you, and you can sit there and you can sleep. You can put your headphones on, and I'll try and use soothing tones. But the basics are so simple that it's inexcusable to not know it by now. It's inexcusable. I'm sorry. I want to keep it, I felt really bad that this person was so upset with me. But to me, it's like, how could you be, such a revolutionary on one hand, and yet not taking 2 seconds to read anything? I mean, we've been going now for about 45 minutes. I read 2 articles. One was very, very long. The other one, not so long. And I've done some, talk in between. But you got to figure, why in the world would somebody have an opinion about this without having done 2 minutes of work? 2 minutes. Folks, the basics. It really is very, very frustrating to me because I do the basics of MMT constantly. And the minute that I step out of the basics and go into like intermediate, I'm not even talking advanced, just the intermediate, I get a whole bunch of pushback from some folks. One like, well, they just want to beat their chest. They just want to beat their chest and, whatnot. But, when I hear somebody say, impeach that motherfucker, that to me is beating their chest, right? That's beating their chest. But they're beating their chest over something that's low-hanging fruit, right? They're beating their chest over low-hanging fruit. I think to myself, wouldn't you rather beat your chest over trying to save lives by ending austerity, ending neoliberalism? I mean, if you elected me, and I'm not running for Congress, I'm not running for anything, but if you can only imagine, I love the Green Party, but I take no prisoners with them. I will literally just punch and punch and punch because I want them to wake up. But I do like them. I care about them. I like Movement for a People's Party, but when they start talking about different things, man, I'm going to punch and punch and punch. And if they block me, they block me. Because the goal here is to wake people up. Hoping somebody else will do the Stuart Smalley, I'm okay, you're okay, and damn it, people like me. I'm hoping that people that are feeling like that can find each other. But in the short term, though, I take no prisoners because there's nobody that's got this right. There's no one that has this right. And there's no gentle way to be the wrecking ball that knocks down the wall that we've built to keep us from this knowledge. It sucks to be the battering ram. It's always nicer to be able to walk through the wall when it's already been knocked down by somebody who had the chutzpah to freaking take the shot. You're welcome. I think of it like this. At some point in time, people are going to have to get over themselves. Austerity is real. It's like, you want to talk about gun control? Let me tell you something. More people die from austerity than gun violence. You don't realize it, but it's true. Why aren't we investing time and energy into trying to control austerity? Why aren't we looking at that like it's the murder that it is? Why aren't we up in arms about that? Because people don't want to take the time to learn. And that has got to be the most unsettling thing once that light goes on for you, my friends. That's got to be incredibly unsettling to know that people are okay with that death because they're too lazy to read a couple articles to figure this out. It's extremely frustrating to me, I can assure you that. Now, let me take it to the next step. Donald Trump has got the government shut down right now. Well, Democrats and Donald Trump, whatever. Donald Trump's playing hardball. He's like, shit, man, I'll keep this thing closed forever, man. If you're going to give me my wall and you're going to do what I say, or that's that. And a very good friend of mine earlier today was saying, hey, listen, I know that there's some people out there that don't understand all these things that want to impeach Trump. He said, but I'm on the impeach Trump side too. Let me explain why. And I said, I'm listening. I can't stand Trump, but I want to save lives, man. So I'm looking at this very differently. And he says, something? He goes, has there ever been a statute or any president that has been impeached or prosecuted or put on record for the racism and the racist Jim Crow laws or any of that? I was like, no, I don't think so. He goes, we have a situation right now where we've got a president who is basically taking these fascist stances that are dangerous, very, very dangerous to minorities, to the point where people like Oprah Winfrey are being accosted. It's not a socioeconomic thing. It is a true Black person thing. People are getting screwed from this badly, Steve. Maybe you can't see it as a white man, but as a person of color, I'm telling you, it's really rough. And we need to impeach this man for this reason. We need to say we're not okay with this. That really took me back. I had to think about that for a minute. And you know something? I've never been a big person on impeachment, period. When they went after Reagan, I kind of laughed at it because he was just doing what had always been done, with Iran-Contra. Don't act like that was some new thing. And then they were out talking about Bush, and then they were talking about Clinton, and they did impeach Clinton for a classy blowjob, in a blue dress, and the definition of is. And then they threatened to go after W, who had 9/11 on his clock, plenty to impeach over there, right? And then, of course, you had the whole birth certificate and Kenya thing and all the other nonsense in impeaching Obama. And now you've got impeaching Trump. It seems like every president, the minute they walk in, is under this impeachment, hearing, the other sides are ready to impeach. But to be fair, Trump has put some things out there that have emboldened people in ways that I'm not comfortable with. I don't like. I wonder why I feel so disgusted with society most of the time. And this is no cover for the Democrats because they're disgusting in and of themselves in their own right. But what Trump's doing is a little different. And you got to be really, really honest with yourself. So I'm not going to be sitting there rushing to the front lines with that spittle on my mouth, screaming, impeach Trump. But I'm not going to be one of those people standing in their way either. If they feel that this is something that they need to do and there's legitimate case and cause, I'm going to support their efforts. I'm not going to be leading the charge to do this because I'm leading the charge in my mind to bring about a Green New Deal and even more than that. But I was told, Steve, I promise you we can walk and chew gum. And I'm like, well, show me, don't tell me. So I think this is important to understand how all these things are interleaving, because what I'm concerned about as you impeach Trump, if you do impeach Trump, is that the Democrats get a false positive, that somehow or another we're signing up for neoliberal austerity. And this is why it's so important that, because I can't control what other people do, right? I can only control what I do. I understand the historical significance and the reason for getting it on the record that we stand against bigotry and we stand against these things. I get it. I do. But I also understand the precedent setting and the way politics works, that Democrats will suddenly say, hey, we've got a completely kneecap party over there. Now we can go ahead and be neoliberal as we want to be. Because I believe, just as Matt Stoller's article said, Nancy Pelosi and all those fools, Steny Hoyer, the bunch of them, they're very, very proud of being conservative Republicans. Fiscally responsible Democrats. Is there a difference? No, there's not. And that's the problem. I don't want it to be done in such a way that we forget how freaking snake, poisonous, venomous, sleazy, scummy people they are. Just because Trump is a shade or two way worse than them. Because the destruction, like I said, from austerity politics is more murder than gun violence. Way more. And they're very proud of their austerity. So let's keep our priorities straight, folks. If they're going to impeach Trump, there's good reason for it. No question about it. But as for me and my house, I'm heading for a Green New Deal. I'm not going to get in their way because I understand it, but my focus is truly ensuring that austerity doesn't kill any more people. So with that, hopefully this was a good lesson tonight. These articles I felt were really good. I only picked 2 tonight because, my God, my throat's sore from reading Matt Stoller's article. God bless him. That was a long article. But there was some good information. So if you guys find that there's questions that you'd like to ask, by all means, send them into our inbox. We'll see what we can do about answering them. Again, the articles, the links will be in the narrative. When you go to watch this over again, you click on the link after it's gone up. Of course, this will go over to YouTube, so you'll be able to see it there and share it there at a later date. And I want to just say tomorrow I'm going to be on with Jordan interviewed me. Jordan Cheriton from Status Quo interviewed me yesterday or the day before. And it'll be running in an all-day marathon over there on his Status Quo YouTube channel. I'll be joined. Lee Camp will be on there. So will Matt Taibbi and myself. So that's not a bad group, man, right? Jordan, Lee, Matt Taibbi and Grumbine. Man, I feel kind of good being in that bunch. So, by all means, I think it starts at noon tomorrow. Jordan's trying to raise money to get his Status Quo up and running. He's got, I didn't realize all the stuff the dude does, but just doing all the freedom of information requests and all the, on site with the camera, running around, flying around, doing different things. He's doing real investigative reporting. It takes a lot of effort and takes a lot of money. So, it's always good to support alternative media, especially when you're not getting these stories anywhere else. But I will tell you this, Real Progressives has taken stances against a lot of our favorite people. It's not because we don't love them. It's because we're trying to fix the world. We're trying to unfuck society. We're trying to change the way austerity is viewed. And that creates some problems every once in a while. And we're trying to do it through media. We're trying to do it through policy. We're trying to do it through activism. And we're trying to do it through education. And it costs a lot of money too. Real Progressives desperately needs funding. So whether you're a small donor and you can provide some sort of a monthly donation, become a patron, we're going to be providing benefits. We have not done a great job with our Patreon account, but we're building a team to support the donations so that we can ensure that we provide Patreon or patron specific content and so forth. And we're really going to try and ramp that up. And I'm hoping that you all will contribute there. And if for some reason somebody out there who's got deep wallets is thinking about something to spend on, folks, we really could use a nice donation. We could use some real funding. The stuff we're trying to do is in no way, shape, or form cheap. To do it right, and you got to realize, think about what we're up against. It's tremendous, well-financed. I mean, people getting $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, $100,000 donations. It's like, who the hell's donating that? Well, we don't want to be bought and paid for. We know what we are. We're fighting. You guys know what we are. We've never hidden it. And we'd like to be able to attract new talent. We'd like to be able to attract people that have the skills so we can actually provide jobs, not just volunteers, but actual jobs, career level jobs, and create that media channel, create that network that actually gives you the filtered truth through a modern monetary theory lens. So you understand the truth about the things you're seeing elsewhere. So you understand the full spectrum of the possibilities that are out there. But we can't do that on a wing and a prayer. We can't do that with any more sweat equity. We burned out our sweat equity. We really need cash equity now. We need your help. So if you would be so kind, look at our Patreon account. Please become a monthly donor. If you can't do monthly, we do have a PayPal. Please do a one-time donation, whatever. And if you've got skills, please volunteer, because we need video editors. We need graphic artists. We need people that can write. We need an editor-in-chief, a real bona fide creative director. We need so many things, folks. And we're asking you for your help. We're hoping we provide value to you. So I'm hoping that as time goes on, that you'll be supporting us, because we need your support. It's like, I'm not joking. We need your support, and we need it badly. So with that, I'm going to call it a night. I'll see you all tomorrow night. Please, again, check me out on Status Quo tomorrow. I believe I'm going on later in the afternoon around 3 o'clock, something like that. But it's on from 12 noon on. In the meantime, I am Steve Grumbine, the founder of Real Progressives. Hope you had a good night. We'll talk soon. Have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.